Denis Cyplenkov is often painted as the villain in a matchup. His upcoming match with Devin is no different. Of course, Denis was the bigger guy last time and he beat up on Devin pretty bad. And again, this time, Denis is the bigger guy and is going into this match with a winning record against Devin. Devin is painted as the hero underdog, trying to avenge his loss from 2018. In some ways, Devin is the one trying to make the comeback against Denis. However, in this video, I want to tell a different story. I want to talk about Denis's comeback, how in many ways, Denis has more of the underdog story, and how remarkable it is that he is even able to compete in this match. Denis had a long, hard-fought battle against a plethora of health issues. He may not be as invincible as he was 10 years ago, but either way, he is still about to compete for debatably the #1 rank in arm wrestling even after everything he went through. This video will tell the story of Denis Cyplenkov's incredible comeback to the sport of arm wrestling. One of the common misconceptions when it comes to the perception of Denis Cyplenkov is his age. Even in 2023, during his comeback, Denis is surprisingly only 41 years old. When I think of Denis's era, I often think of his matches with people like John Brzenk or Richard Lubkes. However, Denis is way younger than both of these guys. When Denis pulled John Brzenk for the very first time in 2008, he wasn't even 30 years old yet. To be at the level Denis was at the age he was, and considering that he used to be only partially committed to arm wrestling, is pretty insane. This goes to show how impressive Denis was and is as an athlete. He rose through the ranks so quickly, even before he was doing much specialized training for arm wrestling. He was still breaking strict curl records, doing bench press, squats, and had a background in strongman. He was nearly at the top of the sport and wasn't even a specialized athlete yet. And as we know, soon after Denis's first victory over John, he became just about unbeatable. Even with very suboptimal technique, he was just so overpowered that he would beat people in the ugliest lanes imaginable, and no one could figure out what to do. He was just way too strong. And this gap only increased as the years went on. Against Andre in 2014, Denis looked like a totally different weight class. His shape compared to Andre's shape is very different. And Andre is one of the best to ever do it, but Denis was still just way too strong, even without optimal technique. Against Dave Chafee that same year, we see more of the same. Denis's arm literally looks like a leg, and it's probably as strong as one too. Denis looked like some crazy combination of an arm wrestler, a strongman, and an IFBB pro all at the same time. And it just continued to get crazier and crazier, all the way up until Denis's match with Devin Larratt in 2018. At this point, Denis had started to train in a way that was more specific to arm wrestling. We saw him incorporating things like back pressure and using cupping handles. And we saw Denis absolutely demolishing records, especially in the area of back pressure. Many would agree that this version of Denis is the strongest Denis we have ever seen, solely based off the insane lifts he was doing. Denis managed 87 kilograms on back pressure for multiple reps. At the time Denis did this lift, it was so far above any of the competition that it wasn't even worth comparing. And of course, all of Denis's preparation made for an easy victory against Devin Larratt. Denis once again displaying his utter dominance. But unfortunately, Denis's highest peak was just before his lowest valley. In order to reach the size that Denis reached, the insane amount of contractile tissue he had, and the immense strength, there was a massive toll placed on his body. And shortly after Denis's victory over Devin, he started to have severe health issues. Issues that no longer allowed him to train heavy or really at all for a long time after this. There isn't perfect clarity as to what initially caused these problems, but the consensus seems to be that Denis was doing some very heavy lifting and ended up rupturing a blood vessel. And of course, anything that Denis was taking at the time couldn't have possibly helped the issue. Denis's blood pressure was already very high, and combining this with the insane weights he was capable of lifting proved to be a bit too much for him to handle. Denis immediately had to stop his training after this occurred and got surgery just after. The surgeons performed a stent insertion procedure in order to fix the blood flow issues Denis was having. A stent is a wire mesh tube that can be inserted into an artery in order to structurally support it and maintain enough space for blood to flow correctly. The stent is inserted into the artery with a tiny balloon inside of it. The balloon is then inflated, causing the stent to expand and then lock into place, keeping the artery open so blood can flow. Now, if that sounds just a little bit sketchy, it's because it is. Trying to blast all the gear under the sun and in turn compete at the highest level in arm wrestling is certainly not ideal when you have a stent, and completely out of the question without first taking plenty of time to recover. Stents are not foolproof and have been known to fail, but generally within the first 3 to 6 months of surgery. And of course, the blood pressure increase from heavy PED usage would not be a good idea either. And really, there wouldn't be any point in doing that anyway, since you can't lift weights or do anything that requires maximal exertion for a good long while afterward. And this is why we saw such a drastic negative transformation from Denis in such a short period of time. Not only was Denis forced to come off the majority or potentially everything he was taking, but he couldn't even lift it all during this time. And to top it all off, Denis began to have nerve issues as well shortly after his surgery. This is why we started seeing one of Denis's eyes begin to function abnormally. Needless to say, Denis was not in the best of circumstances considering where he used to be. He went from being the undisputed champion of the world to someone who couldn't even lift a dumbbell in the blink of an eye. The vast majority of people would have given up, although the vast majority of people would never have reached Denis's level to begin with. So of course, Denis's arm wrestling story did not end here. Denis started ever so slowly nudging his way back into the sport. He was completely calculated and methodical. He didn't rush anything, but instead was slow and steady. One thing you may notice about Denis's comeback is how relaxed he became on the table. Denis was never all that explosive and violent of a puller, but his lack of emotion became even more pronounced after the surgery. Denis was constantly trying to keep his blood pressure as low as possible. Throughout the beginning of Denis's comeback, we heard him talking about not pushing the speed of his climb back to peak strength. Denis was perfectly content to let it take however long it needed to. And all of Denis's patience paid off. Eventually, Denis was able to get back to the level where he defeated John Berzank 6-0 at King of the Table. And it really didn't look that close. Denis didn't quite have the finishing power to just pin John at will, but Denis's stopping power in the center table was evident. You could just see the difference in the facial expressions between Denis and John throughout this match. John is totally redlining and Denis is just hanging out. This victory was already highly impressive, but obviously it did not stop there. Denis continued to progress with his weights and his sparring. And now, in November of 2023, Denis Cyplenkov is about to compete for what may be considered the #1 spot in the world. I have to be honest, when Denis first started talking about coming back to the sport, the idea that he could ever get even close to the #1 spot again did not sound feasible, but somehow Denis made it happen. Denis Cyplenkov has one of the craziest comeback stories the sport of arm wrestling has ever seen. Of course, other people have made comebacks, but I can't think of anyone who came back from as big of a fall as Denis had. It may not be your traditional comeback story, but it is a comeback story nonetheless. Props to Denis for fully demonstrating the heart of a champion.